Imagine driving 3 hours into the deep timber of the Blue Mountains, feeling the air turn crisp and smelling that sharp, sweet scent of ponderosa pine that always meant home, only to walk through your own front door and find a stranger standing there with a pair of industrial bolt cutters and a smile that looked like it belonged on a shark. That was my Friday, and I'm telling you, the sight of my heavy-duty brass padlock lying in the dirt, sheared clean through like a twig, hit me harder than a physical punch because that cabin wasn't just real estate. It was my soul. It was the place my grandfather built with his bare hands back in Oppos, 64, and where my late wife, Clara, spent her last good summer before the cancer took her light away. And there she was, Meredith Vance, the self-appointed queen of the High Ridge Homeowners Association, standing on my hand-woven rug in her pristine white tennis skirt and a visor, casually flipping through a clipboard while her two, associates, in tactical vests started poking through my bedroom like they were looking for a fugitive. She didn't oppose to even look up when I came in. She just purred in that condescending, honey-coated voice of hers that my dues were exactly 48 hours late, and according to Section 14.2, the board hadn't, emergency access rights, to inspect for potential structural hazards that might affect neighboring property values. I just stood there, my hands shaking so hard I had to shove them into my pockets, looking at Claire and Oppos, as framed photos knocked face down on the floor, and for a split second, I felt like the world was ending, but then I remembered the 3 months of meticulous planning I'd put into this exact moment, and I realized Meredith Vance hadn't Oppos. T just walked into a cabin. She had walked directly into a buzzsaw. My name is Elias Thorne. I'm 62, a retired precision welder from the shipyards in Seattle, and I've spent my life measuring things down to the thousandth of an inch, so I know a thing or two about tolerances and how much pressure it takes to make something snap. This cabin, tucked away on 60 acres of rugged terrain at the edge of the Umatilla National Forest, was meant to be my sanctuary, the place where I could listen to the wind in the large trees and finally feel human again after 40 years of soot and noise. My daughter, Maya, who's a fierce defense attorney down in Portland, tells me I'm too stubborn for my own good, but she's the one who brought my grandson, Leo, up here last spring to teach him how to track elk with the same binoculars my dad used. This place is 3 generations of thorn, sweat, and blood. Every cedar plank and every stone in that fireplace was placed there with intention, and for 40 years, we lived in peace with the mountain. But then Meredith Vance rolled in 2 years ago, fresh off a massive payout from a tech firm exit in San Francisco, driving a silver Porsche Cayenne that looked ridiculous on our gravel roads and smelling like an expensive perfume that I can only describe as a, botanical garden having a midlife crisis, She bought the massive glass and steel monstrosity 3 lots over, and within 6 months, she'd maneuvered herself into the HOA presidency with a, modernization initiative, That was really just a fancy way of saying she wanted to turn our rugged mountain community into a curated, sterile resort for her wealthy friends. It started small, the way these things always do, with a polite little reminder, about the stack of seasoned firewood I kept on my porch, which she claimed was an aesthetic eyesore, and then it escalated into a certified letter demanding I repaint the natural, weather-worn cedar of my cabin to a, board-approved slate gray, I ignored the first 3 letters because, frankly, the HOA wasn't Oppos. T even formed until the late 90s, and my cabin had been there for 30 years, before the first paved road even reached the ridge, so I figured I was grandfathered into common sense. I was wrong. Meredith Vance doesn't Oppos. T believes in common sense. She believes in leverage, and she began a systematic campaign of harassment that would have made a mob boss blush, citing me for, unauthorized indigenous landscaping, which was actually the wildflower meadow my wife had planted before she passed, and even claiming my 1974 Ford Bronco, which runs better than her Porsche ever will, was a, derelict vehicle, that needed to be towed. My buddy Silas, who runs the general store down in the valley and sees everything that moves on this mountain, pulled me aside one day over a cold beer and told me, Elias, she's not trying to fix your cabin. She's trying to break your spirit. She's got a silent partner in an LLC called Crestline Retreats, and they've already snatched up 4 properties on the creek after the owners got buried in HOA fines and legal fees. End quote. That was the moment the welder in me took over, the part of me that understands that if you want to fix a crooked structure, you have to find the point of highest stress and apply heat. I didn't in oppose. To get angry, I got quiet, and I started digging into the archives with the help of a retired county clerk named Hattie, who has a vendetta against anyone who wears a tennis visor indoors. We spent nights in the basement of the county records office, fueled by black coffee and old paper dust, and what we found was a masterpiece of suburban corruption. It turns out Meredith hadn't and oppose. T just been, end quote, interpreting, end quote, the rules. She'd been rewriting them. The original 1996 HOA charter had a specific clause, Section 5, Paragraph 3, that explicitly exempted all original structures built prior to the association and oppose as formation from any and all aesthetic or structural assessments. But in the version Meredith had filed with the county clerk in 2022, that paragraph was mysteriously gone, replaced by a wall of text about, end quote, unified community standards, end quote. Hattie looked at me over her bifocals and said, end quote, Elias, this ISN and oppose. T just a disagreement over paint colors. This is a Class C felony. Someone took a digital eraser to a legal document and refiled it as the truth, end quote. But I didn't in oppose. T run to the police right away, because in a small mountain town, the police are often someone in oppose, as brother-in-law, and in this case, the local deputy, Miller, was Meredith's frequent hiking partner. I needed something undeniable, something that would strip away her smug veneer in front of the whole world. So I played the part of the defeated old man for a few weeks, letting the fines pile up, and even, in quote, accidentally, in quote, mentioning at Silas's store that I was thinking about spending the whole month of October down in Arizona to clear my head. I knew Meredith was watching my social media, so I posted a photo of my suitcase packed and tagged a hotel in Sedona, making sure the privacy settings were just loose enough for her to see. Then, I spent 3 nights installing a network of high-definition, motion-activated cameras that were so small they looked like screw heads in the door frames, all of them feeding directly to a cloud server that Meredith couldn't in oppose. T-touch, even if she burned the cabin down. And for the final touch, I called in a favor for my nephew, Gabe, who's a captain in the state's tactical response unit. I told him I had a, end quote, vandalism problem, end quote, and asked if his team wanted a secluded place to run a low-profile training exercise for a weekend. So there we were, that Friday morning. Meredith stood in my living room, her clipboard trembling slightly now because she noticed I wasn't in oppose. T backing down, I was just leaning against the doorframe watching her. She tried to recover her footing, pointing at a small crack in the fireplace hearth and saying, end quote, this is a safety violation, Elias. We'll have to condemn the structure if you don and oppose. T-sell to an approved developer who can remediate the land. End quote. I just smiled at her a slow, cold smile and said, end quote, Meredith, you've got a lot of nerve talking about safety when you're standing a house you broke into, but I think you should meet my house guests, end quote. Right on cue, the bedroom door. And the pantry door swung open, and 4 men in full tactical gear, rifles at the low ready, badges gleaming, and cameras chest-mounted, stepped into the room with the kind of practiced silence that makes your heart skip a beat. Meredith's face went from that fake tan bronze to a sickly, Victorian ghost white in about 3 seconds, and the clipboard hit the floor with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. Gabe stepped forward, his voice like gravel, and said, end quote, Mind oppose, you're currently being recorded on 3 different state-monitored feeds committing aggravated burglary and criminal trespass, and I'd highly recommend you keep your hands where I can see them while we wait for the state troopers to arrive, end quote. The next hour was the most satisfying 60 minutes of my entire life. I sat on my porch, sipping a thermos of coffee, watching the state troopers, who were definitely not friends with Deputy Miller, handcuff Meredith Vance and her 2, end quote, inspectors, end quote, who turned out to be low-level contractors on her husband's payroll. As they led her down the steps, her heels clicking uselessly on the wood she tried to steal from me, I leaned over and whispered, end quote, I found a 1996 charter, Meredith, the one before you whited out the truth, and the state attorney general is going to find it real interesting how many houses your LLC bought right after you filed those fake documents." End quote. She tried to scream something about her lawyers, but the sound was drowned out by the wind suddenly kicking up through the pines, and as a patrol car pulled away, I swear I could feel Clara's presence in the air, a soft warmth on my shoulder that told me the mountain was ours again. I spent the rest of the weekend with Gabe and his team, grilling steaks on the back deck and watching the sun dip behind the peaks, but the fallout was only just beginning. Within a week, the news of the end quote, HOA heist end quote, hit the regional papers, and suddenly, those 4 families who had lost their homes to Meredith's LLC started coming forward with their own stories of forged documents and middle-of-the-night end quote, inspections end quote. The High Ridge HOA was effectively dissolved by a court order a month later, and Meredith Vance is currently facing a mountain of litigation that'll likely strip her of every cent she made from that tech exit. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Even with her gone, I see the way people look at each other on the ridge now. There's a lingering bitterness, a suspicion that has and oppose. Tea quite washed away with the rain. Some people say I went too far, that trapping a woman with a SWAT team was an act of, end quote, unnecessary psychological warfare, end quote, and that I should have just filed a civil suit like a, end quote, civilized neighbor, end quote. They say I've turned our quiet community into a battlefield, and that I'm no better than she was for using power to crush an opponent. But when I look at my grandson playing in that wildflower meadow, knowing that no one is going to come along and call it a, end quote, fire hazard, end quote, or try to paint his heritage slate gray, I can oppose. Find it in me to feel a lick of regret. So, I'm curious, what would you have done if you were in my boots? Was I right to set a trap and involve the state's heavy hitters to protect my family and oppose? As legacy, or is there a point where the, end quote, good guy, end quote, becomes the villain by using the same ruthless tactics as the person he's fighting? Is a home just a piece of property governed by a contract? Or is it something more sacred that justifies any means of defense? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me about your own HOA nightmares, or if you think I should have just taken her to court and played by the rules she was already breaking. Drop a comment. Hit the like button if you think the, end quote, Queen of the High Ridge, end quote, got exactly what she deserved, and make sure to subscribe so you don and oppose. Miss the next time someone tries to tell me what color I can paint my own damn house. Don't let the Karens of the world take your peace. Stay sharp, stay measured, and always keep your cameras running.